at this point, I'm gonna, if anybody has technical assistance on the, what I don't know what's going on. It's not the hardware right now. This is like the best hardware that I could have procured. Um, I've had Xfinity out. We've been under the house. We replaced all the line all the way to the pole. That is not enough. Gonna have to figure this out further. So I'm pretty sure at this point it is somewhere either in, it's probably somewhere in the internet connection. I've worked many, many hours with the internet service provider to try and address this. If anybody works at Xfinity or knows how to get somebody who actually is able to change things or address very complex problems, please do reach out because I'm gonna need it. Yeah, the next step is I gotta string an Ethernet cable all the way through the house because unfortunately this is an old home and there is where the Ethernet port is not close to where the place I need to stream from is, so it's gonna have to be a long cable. I will do that. The newest computers don't have Ethernet ports, so I'll need to buy some more hardware to make that work. So just let me know if you have any ideas or any connections at Xfinity to get somebody who's able to help out. All right, well, I'm just going to continue with the content because there's nothing I can do about it this hour. I'm probably going to spend a lot more time on this. And just for folks on my end, so I know that they're occurring. There's some interruptions that are actually showing up on screen, and then there's some that I think are being auto edited out. So again, I would appreciate it if you can email me rather than putting a bunch of tech advice in the chat right now. I don't necessarily think that's super helpful, but if you could email me directly if you have specific technical knowledge of how to address internet connectivity and in particular stability issues, either in general or specifically with Xfinity, that would be the problem because we've essentially ruled out any hardware reasons for this at this point. It is definitely not a hardware issue. We just replaced all of the actual hardwired cable for the internet from the pole to the router. The router is like 15 feet away. There's no obstructions. And our download speed is super fast, but extremely high jitter per internet testing. So that's something that's going on. Okay, I'm just going to run with it because clearly the issue is not fully solved. So thanks for reaching out if you have any specific advice. So I want to recap Hilary, sort of what happened, what the broader implications are. I want to talk a little bit about California fire season and extend that to the western U.S. and Canada because a lot of what's been going on is frankly a lot more dramatic elsewhere, which is interesting to talk about. I want to reflect a little bit on the ongoing sort of sequence of extraordinary record-shattering heat waves, the most recent of which, well, one of the most recent of which, because have been simultaneous ones ongoing throughout the northern hemisphere all summer, and the southern hemisphere for that matter, but in particular the most recent extremes have been in the southern U.S. where the Gulf Coast cities yesterday and the day before, many of them set new all-time high temperature records. Places like New Orleans, southeastern Texas, parts of Houston have never before experienced temperatures as hot as they experienced this past weekend. So that's another piece I want to talk about. Briefly mention where El Nino is headed, because that continues to be an increasingly big part of the picture. And then a few other things. So it's a bit of a grab bag assortment today because there isn't any new and dramatic weather going on in California. I don't have any new research topics I necessarily want to talk about at the moment. So let's talk about all of these things, run down from the top. So of course, Tropical Storm Hilary is long gone, and there was record-breaking rainfall that occurred. Many spots saw their wettest August day on record in Southern California, and in fact, many places saw their wettest summer day on record in any summer month, so June through August, in over a century of record keeping. So that is actually saying quite a lot, even in a place that is usually dry. There are occasional significant precipitation events in Southern California in summer, and yet in many places this passed all of them in terms of the total daily precipitation. I do think what saved us from even worse flooding in some places, and it was quite serious and substantial. And some roads are still closed, washed out. Some communities are still actively recovering, but this was not the relatively widespread, severe to catastrophic flooding that was potentially in the cards. As I mentioned last time, I think what happened is that the total volume of precipitation that fell was right on target with forecasts, but due to a sequence of somewhat unexpected events, the instability in the atmosphere was not maximized in the eastern sector of the storm, so there weren't as many intense bands of extraordinarily heavy convective thunderstorm downpours in the eastern side of the storm, which meant that instead of bringing rainfall rates of up to 3 or 4 inches per hour, which again, 3 inches or 4 inches per hour is a very extreme rate for anywhere on Earth. It doesn't matter if you're in the desert or not. Those would have occurred in the desert. We only saw rates approaching 1 to 2 inches per hour, so half or less than that potential was realized in terms of the hourly rates. And when it comes to debris flows and flash flooding, those hourly rates actually matter probably about just as much as the total amount of precipitation, if not more, for the very short duration precipitation and flood events. So we sort of escaped, I think, even worse flooding because even though the total volume of precipitation was right on target in most places, the maximum hourly rates weren't as extreme. One place that did see more extreme rainfall on that order and saw extreme flash flooding as a result were some of the mountains in far southwestern Nevada, so just west of Las Vegas. The Mount Charleston area and the Spring Mountains saw some really extraordinary rain rates and then flash flooding. In fact, there's some images of a chairlift, a ski chairlift buried almost up to the top of the chairlift by rocks that were not from a landslide, but from flash flooding. Essentially, all that gigantic pile of rocks, the depth of the chairlift washed downhill during a flash flood and debris flow. So that is the kind of flooding that we could have seen all over across that extreme level of inundation. Some of the communities, the small communities up there, were pretty devastated, where most of the buildings were either washed away or totally damaged. Most of the roads were washed out. That was one relatively isolated area that saw extreme flash flooding. It could have been across like that across a lot of Southern California, but ultimately it was pretty isolated. And there were a few pockets like that in Southern California, but overall, I think we dodged a little bit of a bullet there. But nonetheless, still set new summer rainfall records, sort of mild to moderate flooding. So that definitely was still an issue. And the other interesting thing about it is that, of course, it has brought a lot of moisture to parts of the state that don't usually see a lot of moisture in the warm season. And in particular, it did so toward the end of the summer as we transition towards fall, when fire risk often peaks. So lots of questions centered around this in Southern California have been, well, how does this affect fire season? Well, clearly it mitigates fire season in the parts of the state that saw significant precipitation. And so where was that? Well, that was most of Southern California, west to just east of Santa Barbara. So points west of Santa Barbara on the Central Coast saw little or no precipitation, so Hilary did almost nothing to mitigate fire season there. But it did a great deal to mitigate fire season further east, because heavy rain fell as far west as Ventura County, and then eastward across essentially all of Southern California, including the coastal areas. It extended northward along the eastern slopes of the Sierra and the high desert, certainly, but also spilled west of the crest. So there was less heavy, but still soaking rainfall to the west of the crest, down into the upper foothills in many places. Then there were isolated pockets in northern and northwestern California that saw up to an inch or so of rain as well, not on a widespread basis, but some spots got a pretty good soaking there. So there was that, and that, it has locally mitigated fire season elsewhere in pockets of Northern California. I don't really think we can quantify that as being really a meaningful predictor of what September or October may hold in terms of fire weather in Northern and Central California, but in the southern third of the state, again, subject to that sort of that gradient that I mentioned. So west of Ventura, very little mitigation. East of Ventura, quite substantial mitigation. That's kind of what I would expect to see for at least the next few weeks, with low fire activity to the east of there, generally speaking, or low intensity fire activity at least, and to the west of it, closer to what you would expect based on conditions we've seen so far this summer. So it does help. I think it, in the end, it ultimately may have had more benefits than harms in some parts of Southern California in terms of really giving a boost to soil moisture, in the middle of a hot summer. I think it has had less of effect up in northwestern California. In some places like the Bay Area, really very little, if any, effect, just some isolated showers that fell. So, California was already experiencing a milder fire season, certainly compared to recent years, but even in a long-term context as well. And that's largely because we had a really wet winter, we had a cool spring and start to summer, which is very rare in a warming climate. And then the summer now, in the southern third of California, we sort of diffused that part of fire season with this heavy drenching rain from Hilary. So, that's not nothing. And I do think that northern and central California are most likely to be the subject of getting some real interference on screen here again. My apologies. Just going to pause until it resyncs. Boy, is this just incredibly frustrating. I cannot tell you how many hours and thousands of dollars I've so far spent trying to deal with this. So really, again, I would appreciate some assistance. If anybody has technical expertise who can help out on this side. So I think that fire season-wise, California is looking better than many recent years. We could still see episodes of major wind-driven fires if we get strong offshore wind events prior to widespread soaking rainfall in northern California. That's always the race this time of year now. We're heading towards September. Which comes first, the big offshore winds or the significant rainfall? So never clear what's going to come first, and that's still true this year, except the background moisture levels are not as dry as they've been in previous years, so it's unlikely that we will see as extremely active conditions as we've seen in some past years, in the past decade. So I still think that the odds that this year will end up milder than average overall in California fire season are pretty high, especially given the shifting baseline towards much more active fire seasons we've seen in recent decades. So that's good, but it doesn't rule out the potential for dangerous or destructive fires if and when we get those autumn winds prior to widespread soaking rainfall in northern and central California. And in southern California, although Hilary certainly dampened fire season for now, it can reemerge later in winter. We've seen that before. Later in the fall or winter, if things are warm and dry and we don't get additional precipitation and we get those strong Santa Ana offshore wind flow, then things can dry out awfully quickly. Speaking of which, it's currently very hot again in Southern California. There are heat advisories and warnings currently in effect. And it's a fairly humid heat. Dew points are in the 60s in a lot of places, so it's a fairly uncomfortable heat. You're probably really feeling it. This is not a particularly dry heat. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that it is essentially there's a bunch of water that's in the soil that's normally not there in late August because of Hilary, and a lot of it is evaporating now back into the atmosphere, increasing dew points in the boundary layer, the lowest layer of the atmosphere. So it's a pretty hot, humid period right now again in Southern California. Not a lot of rain, or if any rain is expected with this pattern. So, the heat and humidity will be there for another couple of days before fading. It's warm, but not that hot in Northern California right now. But there is expected to be some locally strong northerly winds near the coast and on the west side of the Sacramento Valley, so the west side foothills. Some of the fires in northwestern California might be subjected to gusty northerly, northeasterly winds over the next few days. That could be a problem given the extent of pretty serious wildfires burning up in far northwestern California and southwestern Oregon right now. There are still ongoing evacuations and displacements up there. So that's the one corner of California that has not seen widespread significant precipitation. In fact, is much drier than usual. That also didn't have as wet a winter or as cool of a spring as the rest of the state, and we're seeing the effects there. Again, fuels matter. The fuel dryness, the vegetation dryness really is making itself known in the places where it is unusually anomalously dry versus unusually damp, which is the case across most of California right now. The one place where it's not true is exactly where we're seeing a very high level of disruptive and dangerous fire activity. So it's a small pocket of California in relative terms, but it is a significant one because it's a place that has not had the high level of fire activity we've seen elsewhere in the state in recent years. So same is true in southern Oregon. We're sort of filling in the gaps up there right now in terms of recent fire history. And it's been a much drier period up there than in relative terms than elsewhere in the state. So I think that's the legacy from Hilary and the current state of fire season. There will be an uptick in fire weather conditions. There could be some moderate sundowner winds in Santa Barbara and County this week. Again, it has not been as wet there as further east, so that will present significant fire risk. It's hot and relatively humid with elevated fire weather conditions, except that the fuels are actually unusually damp right now across a lot of Southern California east of that point. So fire risk is perhaps lower than it would normally be with some breezy winds and very hot temperatures as we're currently experiencing. So elevated but not extreme. Up in Northern California, there's a patchwork of recent rainfall, generally less widespread and significant than Southern California. And in far northwestern California, there are serious fires ongoing that are going to get some wind and low relative humidity at some point later this week. So that's of some concern. Not extreme concern. These are not extreme offshore wind conditions, but they are, moderate ones, north winds. Those can cause problems if you have existing fires or dry conditions for new ones. So nothing extremely out of the ordinary for August or early September, but given that there are ongoing fires, it's something worth mentioning. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that the disruption in the usual atmospheric flow pattern over California has resulted now in a lot of nearshore warming of ocean surface temperatures. So ocean water and the San Francisco Bay water is now much warmer than average off the immediate northern and central California coast. A big change from earlier this year when it was much cooler than average. Such that overnight minimum temperatures are staying quite mild along the North Coast, Mendocino Coast, Bay Area right now. And because the marine layer, it's still there, but the baseline is a lot warmer. So it's kind of a warm, relatively mild, muggy marine layer rather than a very cold and piercing chill. So those elevated ocean surface temperatures, they may start to fade a little bit closer to baseline, but I don't think we're going to see the return of below average ocean temperatures that we had earlier this season. And they may stay elevated now for quite some time until the northwesterly winds return, and if they return in the near future. So that warm, relatively warm, I guess I should probably call it, rather than warm, less cool than average water temperatures off the coast of northern and central California are going to keep things milder along the coast and make it hard to have well below average temperatures just because there's that moderating coastal influence, even with as cooler air masses move overhead. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be extremely hot in the daytime, but it does mean that the floor of how low temperatures are going to go at night is higher than usual. So the daytimes will be somewhat warmer than usual, and the nights might be significantly warmer than usual in your favorite coastal spot in northern and central California. Is there a connection to El Nino? What I want to talk about next. Well, El Nino is continuing to strengthen as expected. It's now edging into stronger, moderate to strong El Nino territory. We'll see if we get there, but the current coupled models say there's a very high likelihood that we do. So that's is still in the cards for later this fall and winter. And so this is going to be a big player in California climate from autumn, probably straight through the winter. And so, this is going to be a story we'll continue to follow. I'll probably have a couple of fully El Nino devoted sessions later this autumn, once it's a little clearer about how things are going to go. But suffice it to say that right now it looks like the choice is between strong and very strong El Nino, and it's definitely an east-based type of event, which tends to produce the clearer winter precipitation effects in California. But then again, it's not the only player in the room, and the rest of the global oceans are hotter than they have ever been in recorded human history. So there are other things afoot as well, and it's not entirely clear how those might interfere with the otherwise quite strong El Nino signal that we would expect from a strong to very strong east-based event in the Pacific this coming winter. So stay tuned for that conversation later, but just for now know that El Nino continues to develop, continues to strengthen, and the current projection is still that we are likely to experience a strong to very strong event by at the peak of the California rainy season. So I do think it's going to be a major player then. The only problem is it might not be the only major player, so we'll see about that. What's going on? There is what appears to rapidly developing hurricane Mexico, Idalia. I believe it's Idalia or Idalia. I actually don't know the pronunciation. I haven't heard it on air yet. But in any case, the name doesn't really matter. This is a storm that's likely to have very significant storm surge impacts on the west coast of Florida, probably the northern half of the west coast of Florida, but potentially including the Tampa Bay area. And that is an extremely storm surge vulnerable part of the country with a lot of people living in storm surge flood hazard zones. So this could be a very big deal depending on exactly where it makes landfall. It looks like it's going to make landfall as a major Category 3 or stronger storm. It's one thing that Southern California doesn't have to deal with, of course. There was never any question that Hilary was going to weaken dramatically before it reached the coast because the ocean was just too cool. That is not the case in the Gulf of Mexico right now, where water temperatures are at or above previous record high levels. So there is a massive amount of hurricane fuel. We keep hearing about these bathtub warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico this year, and this is a hurricane that is likely to rapidly intensify as it sits upon this deep layer of bathtub warm water. The other problem is it isn't just the surface water that's warm. In this case, there is so much warm water deep down that if it churns it up, it's just going to be churning up more hot water. So that's going to be a significant problem. I'm not going to go into in-depth about Idalia except to say that if you're in the area for some reason watching the stream or you have relatives who are, this potentially is a very big deal storm, especially from a storm surge perspective from about the Tampa Bay area northward to parts of the Florida Panhandle potentially. So this is one of those events where I sincerely hope that some of the worst case scenarios don't play out, but the worst case scenario for the Tampa Bay area in this particular setup is actually quite bad, so we'll see what happens. Other folks are doing live streams on that. I'm not a tropical weather expert, so please feel free to defer to them. But I did want to mention it, especially in contrast to Hilary. And as I mentioned earlier, there's just been really record-shattering warmth all around the world, continues, except in California, ironically. But, some really incredible record. This has just been an unbelievably, miserably hot summer along all of the Gulf Coast cities, all the way from South Texas to Florida. Just about, all the records there are to break are breaking now. All times, the single hottest day on record, the highest heat indices on record, the worst combinations of heat and humidity on record. Again, these places are famous for their extraordinary heat and humidity, and yet they're breaking all-time records for both combined. That is a bad sign. This most recent heat wave extended all the way up into the Midwest, so Chicago, west to the Plain States, east to the Ohio Valley, really this massive ridge, hot, humid air, broke a lot of records. Most places saw their hottest temperatures in 20 or 30 years. Some places saw either their hottest temperature on record or their worst heat index, that combination of temperature and humidity on record, which is arguably worse because we know that the humidity combined with the heat makes that heat dramatically more dangerous. It's one thing to experience 115 degrees in Phoenix, which, by the way, is also experiencing record heat again this week. Phoenix, it is between 115 and 117 again, and that means that Phoenix will likely break its all-time record streak for 115 plus degree days. Also, Phoenix will likely then experience its hottest summer on record because the last week in August is once again record hot after an almost entire record month in July and many parts of August as well. Phoenix has just been raked over the coals this year with an unbelievable persistence of 110 plus or even 115 plus degree days. Again, yes, it's been 110 plus or 115 plus before in Phoenix, but not for this many days per summer. It's just been like that the whole season. That's the unbelievable part. And the horrifying story is about the fact that burn units, usually the where fire survivors might go, are full this summer in Arizona because of people who accidentally fell onto the ground and received life-threatening burns from contact with the pavement. That's a pretty shocking thing to have that many people in the hospital because they accidentally ended up on the ground for a few minutes. That's pretty horrifying, and that's what the summer has been like in Phoenix. So yeah, lots of record heat. Southern Europe, many countries just experienced their hottest temperatures on record again, breaking the record set in some cases earlier this summer. Same with North Africa. I mean, there's just so many extraordinary heat records. It's almost impossible to keep track of them at this point. They're falling every day, and it's the only thing that's amazing, and from a California-centric perspective, is that this hasn't really happened in California this summer. So California has been, because of the way the weather patterns have set up this summer, has gotten a huge break relative to almost everywhere else in the northern hemisphere. So I guess you can be grateful for that, but just realize your experience in California is nowhere near approximating the experience of folks almost everywhere else this summer, where it's been just unrelentingly hot. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to cover before jumping into the comments here. Let's see here. All right, going to answer some questions, since I think, as I mentioned, today is partly a test stream, and honestly, it hasn't gone that well, so I'm still seeking formal feedback regarding network connectivity or stability issues, and anything else that might be going on now that it's definitely not the hardware at this point. That needed to happen anyway. I'm glad that in the moments where it's working correctly, it sounds great, according to a lot of folks. But that's not good enough for this purpose and for the amount of effort that's gone into it. So let me take a look. I won't be able to get through all the questions. There's a lot of them, but I want to take some selected ones. A question from Fran at the very beginning about the NOAA's San Francisco Bay Operation Forecast System. I don't have any insights into that at all. I'm not familiar with it, so unfortunately, I would not be the person to ask about that. A question from Grace about after Hilary and this winter's atmospheric rivers. How close are we saying that this has been the wettest year on record for California? Well, one thing I would say is that the anomalousness of the precipitation this winter was greatest in northern and central California. So Southern California wasn't near as extremely wet. But I'm actually... So this is the cool thing right now, since at least hardware-wise I can open something else in the background without crashing things right now. I'm going to pull up something to check that question quantitatively, because I think Hilary's precipitation is now included in, let's see, it's now included in the last January, last October. There we go. Let's see here. And then we can say, just pulling up a couple of web tools here so I can answer that question directly. All right, so here is the answer to the question that Grace asked about which places in California might be experiencing record precipitation this year. So the problem is, as always, using annual averages is super misleading in California. There are some places that saw their wettest winter on record that are definitely not going to experience their wettest year on record. But generally speaking, the relative anomalousness of the precipitation that's been observed between last October and, but this is the last full month. So let's see here. That's a bit different. Well, that does not include yet the precipitation from Hilary, which is going to be significant in parts of Southern California. So none of the data sets have none of the historical quality data sets have fully assimilated that. So I'll have to defer on the full question. But up through the last full month, which would be through the end of July, which again excludes Hilary, there are places, especially in the central and southern Sierra Nevada, as well as the east side of Sierra Nevada, that have seen their wettest year on record from last October through the end of July, at least, since at least the late 1970s in this tool. That's what I can tell. And if I go to another tool, And again, the Hilary additional moisture will probably become integrated into that data set just a few days now as the month changes, so we'll be able to get a better answer for that soon. But right now, I can get this slightly for the longer period of record, going back to the late 1800s. And I can pull that up for the last, yes, for the last 12 months. There we go. So for 12 months ending, I believe this will be late July. Wrong season there. Just pulling this up, bear with me. Elevator hold music. Oh, I see. I was toggling on the wrong button there. That's what's going on. Okay. I promise it will load in just a second. Okay. So, essentially, yes. So, through the end of July, which excludes Hilary, it's essentially the same. It's actually a smaller area. There are some patchy regions all the way from the central coast, so San Luis Obispo County, sort of northeastward in a swath to parts of Kern, Kings County, sort of the southern Sierra. There's some patchy areas there that have seen their wettest year on record for the July 2022 through July 2023 period. That is probably a slightly wider area than if you do August to August, once that data becomes available for parts of the deserts of Southern California, because of course some places from Hilary saw, especially the very dry parts of the deserts, they're more than a year's worth of precipitation from Hilary alone. So I would expect that then would be true for, it won't change anything for Northern California or probably Central California, but it might well change things for the eastern portion of the Sierra, so like the Highway 395 corridor, the Death Valley area, places like that. So ask me again in a couple weeks, and I can give you probably a clearer answer to that. Alright, there were a bunch of tech questions. I'm not going to go through those. Again, folks, please do feel free to reach out if you have technical expertise and want to help me with whatever the heck is going on, since there's like multiple things still happening. There's three separate things. There's the internet jitter, which is extremely high. There is the weird visual artifacts in the lower part of the screen, and that's a new problem. And then there is the fact that there is some mismatches between the audio and the video, which I'm guessing is related to the internet connectivity. Next thing I'm going to try, and I will probably order this today, is an adapter to put a Ethernet cable directly to the laptop, which is surprisingly difficult in this day and age, given the lack of ports on laptops and where routers are relative to where I need to be streaming from. So there'll be a nice cable in that awkward part of the house there. So apparently there is some sort of wildfire in the Santa Cruz Mountains right now, in the San Lorenzo Valley. I suspect that this one is unlikely to become a major problem because weather conditions are not extreme right now, but, you know, obviously pay attention to advice as it unfolds. But I don't expect that to become necessarily an extreme event. Fingers crossed. Let's see here. All right. A question from Marty. If one of the key solutions to wildfire in California is prescribed burning, and we are also getting hotter, and I would add sometimes drier, but not always, sometimes wetter, do you see things changing in terms of conditions that are amenable for prescribed burns? Let's put a pin in that for now, because we actually just got a tentative paper acceptance on that exact topic for a major chunk of analysis that has taken several years to finish through a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy of California. So I think that paper will be public sooner rather than later, and I will, of course, be talking about it here and elsewhere as well once it's officially out in the world. So don't have an embargo date for that yet, but I suspect it should be this calendar year, probably sometime this fall. Can't say anything more about it right now, so stay tuned for that. Has it finally been decided where the path of Hilary's eye, or well, let's call it a center of circulation, because Hilary didn't really have an eye by the time it had degraded over California? There is still a little bit of uncertainty. The National Hurricane Center has it coming literally up the beaches, so following like the Amtrak line from San Diego up into Los Angeles County. Whether it was offshore or not would technically affect whether it made a second official landfall in California or not. It is entirely immaterial in terms of what impacts it had, but it would be interesting if it's later determined that there was in fact a second landfall officially in California. We don't know yet. The National Hurricane Center is very busy, as I mentioned, with other things. It is the peak of hurricane season, and there is currently a major hurricane likely to plow into one of the most storm surge vulnerable parts of the entire country in the next 48 hours. So that's a pretty far down the to-do list at the moment. We might hear more about it in a few months, though, in the postseason hurricane analysis. Yeah, lots of folks suggesting that there are problems on this stream. So I was really hoping that this would just magically solve the problem, but it definitely has not. Forget the echo for a moment. The echo is something I just need to add more foam to the room and stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But here, just talking about some of which are not, and then you can see the spinny wheel of death as I'm actually seeing, as I'm speaking right now, which is a little bit lagged based on when you're seeing it. So again, please do reach out. Really, I am dependent on other people's management at Comcast involved, so please. Question about damage in Death Valley. I still haven't heard very many official reports. Many roads are still closed. There was obviously a lot of flooding and a lot of road damage, but because the hourly rates didn't quite reach the extreme levels, I'm not sure how much permanent or long-term damage there will be to park infrastructure. So we may have just threaded the needle there. I don't know, though. I haven't actually seen any images of flooding in the park. I mean, the main park infrastructure that's at risk, right, are roads, because a lot of the park does not have a lot of infrastructure. There's the visitor centers, and there's a couple of small sort of rest stop style motel gas station areas, but it's mainly the roads, the visitor centers, and then, you know, like the water and power infrastructure that supplies those places. But other than that, you know, it's a geologically dynamic place, and it's been kept that way partly because, in large part, because it's a national park. There are not a lot of people who live permanently nearby. There are some, but not very many. And from what I'm hearing, the damage to infrastructure is not catastrophic. It's more that there were some road washouts, but it was mainly roads that were inundated and then had rocks and mud and stuff wash over them. That's not really catastrophic flood damage, so maybe the park, you know, came out relatively unscathed, but I haven't really seen any images, and unfortunately Death Valley National Park is completely silent across all of social media for some years now, so I'm sure that there might be somebody, the journalist could probably call a park superintendent or something and get a better sense, but I haven't seen any images, so I don't know. So a lot of questions about wildfires in this year. I think I covered that earlier, so apologies. I'm getting waiting here to the end. Yeah, as Brian mentions, the spinning wheel has got to be due to the jitter. I'm pretty sure that is the singular problem that is causing the most issues. I think it has to be. And that is the one that I am least equipped to deal with. So if anybody specifically has advice, I know I've said this like 20 times, but if you want it to improve at this point, I'm going to need some assistance from someone in the IT community or somebody at Xfinity or somebody else who wants to build a direct fiber line to our house in this neighborhood that apparently is neglected by the telecom companies. It's hard to know that before you move to a place. There's really no systematic way of finding out, but I'm finding out the hard way, unfortunately. And so we've tried all the low to moderate hanging fruit. Now it's going to be it's going to be the fruit that so I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover today. Again, I didn't have a very comprehensive lineup. I've answered most of the questions that folks have. Thanks again for the support. I do have much better hardware, and that still is helping and will continue to help. In the future, it will mean that I can run several different programs during big events in California and share stuff up on screen, as I have during a couple of the big storms of the past year, Weather Channel style, without things crashing or freezing. So I think that at least will be an option. I still need to get the connectivity issues fixed, but in the meantime, this is I do appreciate the support through the crowdsourcing. I'm going to leave that up because a lot of folks had asked previously if there were ways to help out, and so I'll leave the I know folks like different things, so I'll keep that up. Yes, I think I'm gonna call this one a day for now. Again, folks who have relatives in the Tampa Bay area or between there and the Big Bend region of Florida, make sure they know this is the big one for that part of the state in terms of hurricane and storm surge risk. This will be an event that we haven't seen there in many decades. So take it very seriously. Again, I don't think there's a lot of people in this audience who are necessarily in that part of the country, but folks have relatives and friends everywhere, and often it means more coming from somebody you know, rather than hearing it on the radio or TV or something. So with that, I think I'm gonna cut this one off, and I'm gonna probably spend a lot of hours on the phone with Xfinity and buying adapters and reading the emails that are hopefully pouring in from IT experts and executives at Xfinity for how the heck to deal with this. Or from competing internet service providers in my area who might be able to offer better services. This is Xfinity is the only entity in our area that supposedly has gig speeds, but the reality is with this much instability, it does not matter how fast the internet is because for uploads it's extraordinarily unreliable. So, corporate shout out. Maybe I'll have to do it on Twitter or X if any of the corporations are still there. Maybe I missed my window on that one. That's a story for another day.